In this lesson, we'll learn about joints. Joints are used to deform characters and objects. So any 3D character you've seen has a joint system or a skeleton that is driving it in order to perform. Now, in our case, what we'll do is create a joint system for our fueling line. And then we'll eventually have the fueling line connected to our ship. So this is again another cool topic we're about to get into. Let's go ahead and move our ship in place. Now, what we'll do is grab our global control and move it that way. Remember, the global control is used to reposition these type of assets. So I'll go ahead and use some values here to bring the ship back. In the translate x-axis, we'll put in negative 671.202. In the y-axis, that will be 278.108. And then in the z-axis, 164.912. All right, beautiful. So guess what? We're ready to create a joint chain. Now, typically, you want your joints drawn in an orthographic view. Now, the reason why is if you try to draw your joint chains in, let's say, a perspective view, you don't really know where they're going to end up. Just to kind of show you this, I'll go ahead and switch back over to the perspective. And I'll go ahead and grab the joint tool under the skeleton menu in the animation module. So if we were to go ahead and just try drawing our joints out, all right, they may look a certain way. However, if we were to go ahead and start to orbit, you can see not exactly what we expected. All right, so I'll go ahead and remove this chain. We can grab the root object and get rid of it that way. Now, in our case, we have something a bit unique in that our hose goes all over the place. So what's the best way to create this? Well, let me go ahead and introduce you to a rigging trick we can use to get all of our joints lined up ideally. What we'll basically do is connect each joint to a point tied to a CV curve that follows the hose's direction. The only issue is we don't have a curve to work with. Remember, we removed it. So what can we do? Well, we could always create a curve from one of the isoparms from our fueling line. So to do that, it's just a matter of right-clicking on the hose and choosing isoparm. And now we can go ahead and grab one of those isoparms. And at this point, using our hotbox, we can use Edit Curves, Duplicate Surface Curves. Just go into the options just to show you I'm working with the default settings. Beautiful, so now we have a curve to work with. Let's go ahead and center the pivot on the curve, because by default the pivot's going to be at the origin. Alright, so at this point we could start to move this in place. So you might want to go to wireframe mode. Much better. So I'll go ahead and move this in the z-axis to center it. And then we could also move it forward in the x-axis. Alright, so everything looks pretty good. At the end, we can straighten this out a bit more or center it a bit better by going to component mode. We'll hit F8 on our keyboard, and now we can grab a few of the vertices and start to adjust these, just bringing them up a little bit more. I'll leave the endpoint where it's at. I like where this is, so we don't want to interfere with its position. So we just wanted to bring up these last few points. Great. All right, so we're now ready to basically create a set of points we can use to snap our joints to. In order to do that, we can work with clusters. Now, clusters are a way of controlling components. So if we were to go back to component mode, just hitting F8, see how we can go ahead and grab this point and start to move this around. But it's not too ideal for animation. However, with a cluster, you can actually create a transform handle to drive this point directly. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Hitting F8 to go back to object mode with the curve selected, We can use our hotbox again, just holding down the space bar, and choose Edit Curves. I'll go ahead and tear off this menu. And then we can choose Selection, Cluster Curve. That will create a cluster for each point on this curve. So if we were to close this out, go to the Show menu and turn off NURB Surfaces, let's take a look at this. If we were to grab one of our clusters now, I'll deselect our curve, and then start to move this around, notice that same point is now being driven more conveniently by this cluster object. Beautiful. Alright, but in our case, we're not using these as controls. We're just using these to connect the dots. Alright, so let's go ahead and get right to work on that. If you'd like, you could also hide polygons just to make it a little bit easier to snap to each point. So at this point, we can now grab our joint tool under the skeleton menu. I'll hold down the V key and we can go ahead and vert snap to each cluster. Great, so there's our joint chain being drawn out. Beautiful. So once we get to the very end, we can now hit Enter to set this chain. So let's go ahead and talk about the joint chain we have. What you can see is that each joint is parented to the one above it. So this is called forward kinematics, or FK. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to use an IK system. We'll need that to tie this joint chain so that it will follow our ship. Okay, so what I've done was brought back the two levels we've hidden, NURB surfaces and polygons. And let's go back to shaded mode. Now if your joints are too large or too small, you can always adjust their size globally from your display menu. So that's Display, Animation, Joint Size. So at this point we can go ahead and set an ideal size for each of these. Let's say about a value of 3. So that's one way to do it. Another way, if we were to go to wireframe mode, is to select each joint and adjust its radius. So that way you have independent control over each joint size. I kind of like the joint size the way it is, set to 3, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. But what we'll want to do from here is go in and remove all of those clusters. We no longer need them. They've served their purpose. And for that reason, we can always get rid of our curve as well. So I'll go in and grab all of the cluster objects, control click our curve, and delete. Okay, beautiful. So there's our joints. Let's go ahead and rename them again to stay organized. So a fast way to do that is to use the Search and Replace tool under the Modify menu. So let's grab our very root joint at the very top. Remember, you can hit the up arrow until you get to joint 1. And I'll go to Modify, Search and Replace Names. Let's go ahead and make sure this is set to Hierarchy. I'll reset the settings. So what we're searching for is joint, since that's our prefix that we'll want to change. And let's go ahead and rename this to JNT underscore hose. So now, when we choose Replace, not only has the selected joint been renamed, but every joint in this hierarchy now matches the naming convention. Beautiful. All right, well, at this point, we can go ahead and stop our lesson. We have our really neat joint chain built, and we've conformed it to our fueling line in no time at all. So in the next lesson, we'll learn about inverse kinematics.